Well, hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to my review of Resident Evil 2. That's right, the original old dog himself. One of my favorite games of all time, and if it's not my favorite Resident Evil game, it's definitely in my top 2, probably between this and Code Veronica. It's just been released on PC on the GOG storefront a couple of days ago, so I've been playing that non-stop and clocked through scenarios A and B, but we'll talk about all of that in the structure. But, you know, I suppose to front load, this video is twofold. Obviously, I highly recommend it. I'm very, very biased, but I would argue how much of that is nostalgia, probably a lot for sure, but it's still a fantastic game in its own right, and it holds up incredibly well. Shonky graphics, tank controls, it doesn't actually matter. It works fundamentally because it has some really strong construction, some really original narrative, I suppose you would call it meta construction, which you don't really see even in subsequent Resident Evils, which in a way makes this the strongest one because it did such unusual stuff with the scenario structure. But also there's some sort of fundamental, almost primal components to the story, especially things like Claire and parenthood and saving kids and all that sort of stuff, but it is kind of evergreen in its narrative appeal for something that at a blush, if you didn't know any better, is just about killing zombies. So yeah, I'll front load the sort of important info. It's great, it holds up, it performs perfectly, which is wild. Everything seems to be broken and bugged these days, or in early access or whatever. No, this is very feature complete and just didn't even skip a beat. I might have had to reset it at the beginning to configure my control properly, but that was it. No crashes, no hitches, no nothing, ran smooth as butter. And to be clear, it's part of a trilogy project that Capcom has released on GOG. So this is a PC port, I suppose. Not a lot of bells and whistles. A few quality of life things in there, like you can door skip, which is to say, if you don't know, there would be loading screen doors. It's quite an elegant and now cultural touchstone in a way of masking the loading screen in this survival horror sort of little room-based scenario thing with very little memory. But because you don't need that as much, you can skip the door thing, which is a welcome addition. Given the Metroidvania type construction of these games, there's a lot of back and forth, and once you familiarize yourself with an area enough, you will want to be skipping those doors. While I'm on quality of life as well, the only other real thing that jumps out at me is that the bonus scenarios, Fourth Survivor, Hunk, and, you know, Tofu for memes, these were hidden scenarios that you could unlock by beating the game X times on a certain difficulty, which essentially was all about speed and less saves. And, you know, it was early days speed running and challenge mode sort of stuff, which not everyone's interested in. I'm a super fan of Resident Evil, and I have no interest on doing that sort of crap. I enjoy the game on its merits. I'm not really interested in trying to just beat it in, you know, 40 minutes or whatever. So for those that want to check out those cool little challenge scenarios but don't want to unlock them with those old methods, here you go. They're there from the menu. So yeah, all three of them are releasing on GOG. One released a couple of weeks ago, this released a couple of days ago, and presumably 3 will be out in a couple of weeks as well. So that's the important thing. If you're a fan of old, go back, pick this up, play it again. It holds up so well. I probably haven't played through this in 10 years or something, and there's so much that I have forgotten that was in it. But for those that maybe just a fan of the channel and just enjoy my videos and recommendations, I will break down the game in an attempt to press gang you into checking it out yourself. Maybe you're younger, maybe you missed it at the time, you know, but it is always difficult to pitch a game that, I mean, this came out in 98 originally, to pitch a game to someone that doesn't have nostalgia glasses on looking at it, especially when you've got such wonderful fare in opposition in current year. So Resident Evil 2 was a huge explosion. It was a big phenomenon. Resident Evil 1, it has its cult following at the time, and it's difficult to sort of put yourself back in those shoes because people have a revisionist take of looking at history, especially with this series. There's been so many sequels, re-releases, remasters, and remakes, and they're having a bit of a golden period at the moment. It can be hard to sort of separate how the world perceived these games at any given time. So Resident Evil 1 was great, but a lot of people, and kind of myself included, slept on it back in the day, but it very quickly developed an aftermarket cult following. And by the time Resident Evil 2 hit, the stars kind of aligned with the age group and the fandom. I actually see a lot of overlap between Resident Evil 1 and 2's release to Alien and Aliens reception. Now, a lot of people will tell you Aliens is the better movie, and I think that's because it's more of a mainstream audience appeal, and so it has wider capture. I think, don't make me choose between my children, but like, I love Alien and I love Aliens, but there's no denying that the Cameron-esque 80s Americana bombastica of Hollywood was in full swing at the time, and the same people that will tell you that Aliens is the best are the ones that will tell you Terminator 2 is the best, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but this game actually sort of channels a lot of the same food groups from the ramping it up in stakes and budget. The game starts in the middle of an outbreak, which is not something you probably would have ever dreamed would have happened after being a fan of the sort of closed mansion of the first game. The idea of having to escape through a city overrun with zombies everywhere was an absolute dream come true and a technological marvel as well. But even from some of the storytelling, specifically with my girl Claire, who as far as I'm concerned is the main character, and I prefer her over Leon. Again, another sacrilegious call, but she shares a lot in common with Ripley and Newt in her story, and there's some very primal components to it that kind of make it evergreen. Not to lose the thread too much, but for example, Last of Us 1 is what I would argue a kind of evergreen game that will stand the test of time, pretty much for very similar primal human story fundamentals in the parent and surrogate child through line. Not to get sidetracked, but to give you an idea, there are aspects of that in here, and it still holds up thematically to this day. Now, mechanically, it's a survival horror, and I'll give you a very quick Soldiers 5 on, what that is. Maybe this will be your first one. That would be wonderful if it was. But the survival horror formula was absolutely solidified with this game. It was laid out and pioneered in Resident Evil 1. And don't get me wrong, I know there are other things like Silent Hill around the time, and they drew a lot of inspiration from Alone in the Dark. But the Resident Evil brand of survival horror is the cornerstone for all survival horror, of which it is either derivative or, embellishes upon or spins off of. And again, and not to lose the thread, I bring this up often, it's not strictly a horror-specific genre per se. It's just that the mechanics that are associated with it are also closely associated with the horror zombie component too. So you have to manage your inventory, and you essentially have to explore a space or multiple spaces over the course of the game, police station into chemical plant and all sorts of laboratories and basements, and the first game was similar as well. And a lot of it is back and forth backtracking a la Castlevania type games, but instead of being locked out by abilities per se, you don't have the double jump or this, that, or the other. It's more about you don't have the hearts or the diamonds key, or maybe you need to turn power on here or this, that, or the other. So there'll be a lot of doors and passageways that are closed to you until you find the correct item to pass through. And then you mix in with that, you've got very limited item space, you've got the typewriter ink ribbon system, which most people would have come to have known or at least heard about. Then you've got a universal storage system, usually coupled with these safe rooms, which again, another cornerstone of the genre laid out here. Music and safety replete and all, a moment of respite from the storm. But they'll have a shared storage and a typewriter save point, generally speaking. There is exceptions, but that is the rule. As much as I know my way around the game and flew through it, but not necessarily to clip, I enjoyed myself. I mean, I clocked the first scenario in 5 hours or thereabouts, and I think I beat the B scenario in maybe 3 or 4 hours. But I still had each time like 20 spare ink ribbons, which is essentially the ability to save. And I was saving fairly liberally as well. So even if you put off at this, maybe you find it stressful or you're worried that you're going to be shit, I guarantee you will be fine. And I'm pretty liberal with the kill every zombie every time, and I still had ammo by the end of it, though I was cutting it fine at the end of Leon B. It's probably worth talking about those scenarios actually, because that is one of the things that, now, you're really going to test my memory here. Resident Evil is fairly experimental with playing with its formula, but I don't know if anyone ever really did it quite like the AB disc setup of Resident Evil 2. And to my mind, it is the strongest thing, and it should be replicated in modern games. Like if you're a developer making a survival horror throwback game, you should be doing AB disc scenario layouts like Resident Evil 2. So what am I talking about? Okay, so essentially, and it works the same when you load up this version, you have to pick who you're going to play as. It's either Leon or Claire, the two main characters of this story. I'm not 100% sure what all the canon definitions are, but whoever you pick to start the game with, that will be your A play run, your playthrough, your first playthrough, whatever you want to think about it, but sequentially, you play through with that character. Now, when you do clock it and see credits and end it, in my case about 5 hours later, you'll get the opportunity to save state that game then. And then if you play through more, you actually flip characters and you get a B scenario, which is very different. And it shows you the other side of the scenario. There's still commonalities, you're still in the same play space, but a lot of the puzzles are changed up, different story beats and what have you. And look, just to lay it down anecdotally as well, I played through Claire A, but I think arguably most people will play through Leon A. I think he probably has the most appeal, but I think he has the weaker story, which is probably sacrilegious at this point when you're going up against the majority opinion. But apart from their side characters, like Claire has Shelley and Annette to a point as well, and Leon has Ada, and other sort of B characters pop up. So they have their own plot that goes on as they move through. But most of the scenario is kind of identical. You're going to have the same world puzzles, the same A to B to C through the level, whether you pick Claire or Leon first. So it's probably worth explaining that yes, they have their own unique twist to it, but there are entire story plots. And, I know the statute of limitations is up, but I still don't want to spoil it. If you don't play the B side, the second scenario, the new game plus, whatever you want to call it, you are cheating yourself out of a very big chunk of the game, where it essentially adapts and basically reads your previous save file. So if you did play through as Claire A and then you play Leon B, the story is reflected in that. And there are some scenarios where there's even sort of hand-me-down crossover, which you still don't see stuff like that. Like Prey Moon Crash was heralded for the idea of doing multiple runs through a game, and if you interfere with items, then the next character through that instance will be affected. Now, it's very light in this. Maybe you leave certain items for Leon for his playthrough, but it's still there all the way back in the bloody 90s. Yeah, it's really cool. And then there's like a fake out, one of the coldest boss endings you're ever gonna see.
Game over.
But like a fake out epilogue after the second ending and some more gameplay. And while I'm obviously a big fan of Claire and her story, generally speaking, both protagonists have a lot of heart. So Leon's sort of through line is that he's just a well-to-do goody two-shoes rookie, and he is paired up with a foil, which is this mysterious chick named Ada, who is, cagey and not all she says. There's a will they, won't they romance undertone, but she is in fact a foil to him. Very femme fatale, murky morals, that sort of stuff. And that's why they make such an interesting duo. They play off of each other. Whereas on the other side, you've got Claire, essentially being a surrogate mum / older sister to this lost girl, and their interplay is really quite cool as well. It's a shame that we don't see more of this stuff playing to the strength of a female strong lead, which is leaning into the mother bear maternal angle. Like everyone heralds, well, for example, Aliens and Terminator 2, both great examples of it, and yet no one wants to replicate it either. Where are all the strong female leads? Well, maybe you're not constructing your story with the appeal of what makes a woman a fucking psychopath savage is interfering with children in harm. And it seems strange that I have to explain this out loud. Humanity really must be doomed. But anyway, I digress. But even then, there is some subtle complexity. You come up against the girl's mum, Annette, who's sort of a bit of an absentee mum, scientist, committed to her work and kind of enraptured with her husband's nefarious, arguably evil work. Having pseudo-redemption arc, you'll cross over at gunpoint, but then you'll both team up and split up to try and find the daughter. That they're united in their wants to protect the innocent. Anyway, like I said, it's not exactly super deep, but you'd be surprised that it's becoming a bit of a lost art form to even just understand what's the point of telling stories in the first place. We have these writers and voice actors that can just suck all the air out of the room with walls and walls of text and platitudes, and yet this game with very little can say so much more. But yeah, it was good, nice and challenging. I died a couple of times. It is one of those things that, you know, you don't necessarily, especially if you're rusty or you haven't played before, you don't want to ride the lightning too hard. You can be liberal with the saves, but there will be points, because you don't necessarily see it coming, where you'll be in a boss fight and you'll be like, well, fuck, I don't really have the gear for this and I'm kind of doomed to die. It's only really going to set you back a few minutes. There are some actual legit jump scare sort of moments that are well earned that did scare me socks off. And while like there's no auto aim, maybe there is, and I could have turned it on in the settings, but it's not on by default, which was interesting because it was on by default on Resident Evil 1, the version I had a look at. But at the same time, it didn't really make a difference. You're pretty liberal with, like, when I say auto aim, it's not like your aim locks to a target, which it often does in these games. So you wheel around and you fire, but it still hits the target even if you're left or right of field pretty well. So I would argue the gunplay works quite well. And having to wheel around after you walk through a door and you realize there's a zombie right there is always stressful, and it's great fun. But yeah, I cannot stress enough that the complete version of this game is 2 playthroughs back to back as the 2 different characters. If you were to just play through it once and put it down, which I'm sure people probably have because it's very experimental, dare I say avant-garde, and that may well explain why we haven't seen this sort of design in modern times. The fact that, I don't know, maybe 50% of the player base never even saw the second story and got the other half of what actually happened with this character or that character or bloody Mr. Trenchcoat, Mr. X boss or whatever. Like, he doesn't even show up until the second game or second half. But I'm kind of perplexed that something like this can stand apart and alone, and for decades it just hasn't been taken on as the norm. Again, we have a current gaming scene and industry that has been co-opted by all these creative artiste writers that think they know better. In all of their writing, it's all very me, and, you know, you would think that they would be interested in their push to leave their mark, to have actual unconventional and interesting storytelling mechanics like this, but no, this is the hallmark of actual clever, innovative design, and it sort of answers that unspoken question that, yeah, talent is kind of skipping a generation these days, and it hurts my soul. Anyway, all in all, brilliant game. Loved it to death. It was wonderful coming back to it. My recommendation is, whoever you are, whether you love these games, whether you slept on them, whether you were younger and you missed them, and even if you bloody hated them, everyone should get this. It's perfectly reasonably priced. It runs like a dream. And if at the very least you feel that you're jaded and maybe even priced out of the market, you know, I'm not going to dig up about Star Wars Outlaws because I still stand by everything I say, but people are right. You know, these price points and this quadruple A bullshit is getting out of hand. I am offering you an alternative, one of the greatest games that you are ever going to play at a reasonable price, and now on PC. Anyway, team, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.